So today we begin chapter 5, the last chapter of Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. As usual, after the conclusion of the previous chapter, which we saw concluded with the bird girl image, which critics would call an epiphany. The theory of epiphany was explained by Joyce or dealt with by Joyce in the earlier draft of the novel, which is called Stephen Hero. So a moment of revelation is called epiphany, a term borrowed from religion. After such a spiritual, we may say, or we may say mental experience, the usual pattern of Joyce is to alternate it with a realistic scene, and we see that chapter 5 begins with a realistic scene. Stephen is described at home with his family members and he is getting ready for the university. He will go to attend classes. In this chapter, some university classes are also described, and the kind of things that Stephen was reading or studying at this point. For example, on the third page of this chapter, we see it is mentioned that he was reading Aristotle's Poetics and Psychology and a Synopsis Philosophiae Scholasticae ad Mentem Divi Tome, that is the divine Thomas Aquinas, his synopsis of his philosophy. Why is it mentioned at the beginning of the chapter? Because in this chapter, Stephen will kind of offer his aesthetic theory, in which he would draw from Aquinas' theory on art, and we see a number of dialogues that take place in this chapter. So earlier I gave you a synopsis of the novel. I have mentioned that in chapter 5 we have first Stephen's conversation with the dean over the subject of language. Then we have a reference to a student named McCann who presents a petition for universal peace and asks every student to sign, and Stephen refuses to sign it. We have a dialogue between Devin and Stephen, and Devin comes from an Irish peasant family, and in this we have an indication that Stephen dislikes Irish nationalism and Irish culture. We have a dialogue between Lynch and Stephen, another university student, and this would be on Stephen's aesthetic theory. Then we have again the rose image, Dante's white multifoliate rose in Paradiso. Why is it here? Because we know that in his aesthetic theory, Stephen would replace his religion by his idea of art. So that is another epiphany. And the chapter ends with his journal entries in the first person. So at the end of the novel, we have first person narrative in the form of the journal entries, suggesting that Stephen attains his maturity or his psyche comes to full development when he is ready to write in the first person. Simultaneously in this chapter we will see that Stephen's idea of poetry also comes to some maturity, and he composes a villanelle, a form of lyric poem. So basically he is depicted with a number of contrast or foil characters, we may say, of the other students of his class, and how he is different from them. On the 7th page of this chapter, Stephen thinks about his friend Devin, and through Devin's description of his own experience also we find an idea of Ireland, an idea which forms in Stephen's mind. So as Stephen thinks about Devin, the paragraph begins, side by side with his memory of the deeds of prowess of his uncle, Matt Devin, the athlete, the young peasant worshipped the sorrowful legend of Ireland. So Stephen refers to Devin as the young peasant. The gossip of his fellow students, which strove to render the flat life of the college significant at any cost, loved to think of him as a young Fenian, that is, one who supports Irish nationalism, the Fenian movement. His nurse had taught him Irish and shaped his rude imagination by the broken lights of Irish myth. The reference here is to Stephen. So he was taught Irish by his nurse. He stood towards this myth upon which no individual mind had ever drawn out a line of duty, and to its unwieldy tales that divided themselves as they moved down the cycles in the same attitude as toward the Roman Catholic religion, the attitude of a diluted loyal serf. So Stephen finds that there is nothing beautiful, not a single line of beauty as he says, nothing beautiful about Irish nationalism, and he is expected to have an attitude of a loyal serf towards this nationalist movement, just as he is expected to be loyal to Roman Catholicism. Whatsoever of thought or of feeling came to him from England or by way of English culture, his mind stood armed against in obedience to a password. And of the world that lay beyond England he knew only the foreign legion of France, in which he spoke of serving. So he always felt hostile towards English culture and English language, and apart from England he knew about France, and he thought that he would serve in France. Coupling this ambition with the young man's humor, Stephen had often called him one of the tame geese. So, these are about Devin, and Devin's ambition makes Stephen think of him as one of the tame geese. Why tame geese? Because he seems to be loyal both to Irish nationalism and Roman Catholicism, unlike Stephen, who dislikes both of these. And there was even a point of irritation in the name pointed against that very reluctant of speech and deed in his friend, which seemed so often to stand between Stephen's mind, eager of speculation, and the hidden ways of Irish life. So in Devin's character, Stephen could see a reluctance to speak and act, some kind of a lethargy. On the contrary, Stephen was extremely proactive and eager to learn about a lot of things, including about Irish life. And then one night, the young peasant, so repeatedly Stephen refers to Devin as the young peasant. He tells Stephen a story of his life, that one night he was traveling by the road, and he was very thirsty, and he approached a hut where he saw a woman standing outside the door. And Devin described this experience because it is an experience of sexual arousal for a young man like Devin and Stephen. It is normal to exchange such experiences. She was half undressed as if she was going to bed when I knocked, and she had her hair hanging. And I thought by her figure and by something in the look of her eyes that she must be carrying a child. She kept me in talk a long while at the door, and I thought it strange because her breast and her shoulders were bare. She asked me was I tired and would I like to stop the night there. She said she was all alone in the house and that her husband had gone that morning to Queenstown with her sister to see her off. And all the time she was talking Stevie, she had her eyes fixed on my face, and she stood so close to me I could hear her breathing. When I handed her back the mug at last, she took my hand to draw me in over the threshold and said, "Come in and stay the night here. You have no call to be frightened. There is no one in it but ourselves." I didn't go in, Stevie. I thanked her, and I went on my way again, all in a fever. At the first bend of the road, I looked back, and she was standing at the door. So this experience, from this we learn that Devin was moralistic, so he didn't accept the invitation of this woman, and he politely thanked her and left. But this creates a strong impression on Stephen's mind about Ireland. So women like these, they in Stephen's psyche, they identify with Ireland. So Stephen often refers to Ireland in various in a pejorative way, in a disparaging way. Sometimes she calls Ireland the scullery maid of Christendom, and when he thinks of this woman, he speaks of her bat-like soul. So as if Ireland has a bat-like soul, and a little later Stephen refers to the flower girl who tries to sell him her flowers. So these different women figures, they merge in Stephen's psyche to create a consciousness or an idea of Ireland. The last words of Devin's story sang in his memory, and the figure of the woman in the story stood forth, reflected in other figures of the peasant women whom he had seen standing in the doorways at Clane as the college cars drove by, as a type of her race and his own, a bat-like soul waking to the consciousness of itself in darkness and secrecy and loneliness, and through the eyes and voice and gesture of a woman without guile, calling the stranger to her bed. So notice the use of the image of bat. A bat also flies, but it cannot soar. So it is not a bird. Therefore, by comparing Irish women or Ireland to a bat-like soul, Stephen imagines that nothing can soar high in Ireland. There is no idealism, and everything everybody seems to be waiting in secrecy and darkness. And then the flower girl tries to sell him flowers, but he has no money, so he couldn't buy. So these are the indications of the development of Stephen's psyche as a young man, and his kind of loathing of Ireland, not only because of the poverty, but because of the ugliness. So the fact that a woman would guilelessly offer herself to a stranger does not appear to be very, very appreciable to Stephen. Not because of any moral reason, because Stephen is not a moralist, but because of this idea of selling oneself cheap or selling one's soul, so to say, having no ideals, having no higher ambitions, or having no aesthetic sense. Then we have a dialogue with the dean. The dean tries to be very clever and witty in this dialogue because he knows that Stephen is very good in language and literature. So the discussion begins with that of art. And Stephen says, Aquinas, answered Stephen, says, pulchra sunt que visa placet. So he borrows this phrase from Aquinas. This Latin phrase means that is beautiful, or those are beautiful, which please the eye. Pulchra means beautiful. Sunt are que those, visa the eye, placent please. So those which please the eye are beautiful according to Aquinas. Later Stephen would explain to Lynch, discussing the aesthetic theory, that Aquinas did not mean only that which we see by the eye, only visual experience, but all sense experiences. Those which please our sense experiences, they are beautiful. Then this fire before us, said the dean, will be pleasing to the eye, will it therefore be beautiful? Insofar as it is apprehended by the sight, which I suppose means here aesthetic intellection, it will be beautiful. But Aquinas also says, bonum est in quod tendit appetitus. Bonum means good. So that is good which satisfies our appetite. Insofar as it satisfies the animal craving for warmth, fire is good. In hell, however, it is an evil. And as the dean speaks to him, Stephen acutely observes him. Stephen saw the silent soul of Jesuit look out at him from the pale, loveless eyes. Like Ignatius, he was lame, but in his eyes burned no spark of Ignatius' enthusiasm. So, Jesuit priests are described by Stephen as sinister, people. Like if you remember his interview or his discussion with the rector, the rector looked like a sinister figure there. So the silent soul of a Jesuit look out at him. So here also we have this idea of a fixed stare and kind of a bat-like soul silently waiting for catching its prey. The pale, loveless eyes suggest that. And though Ignatius Loyola, who founded the Jesuit order, he was an inspired person. Enthusiasm means inspiration. But the other ordinary Jesuit priests, they did not have this inspiration. They only followed his rules and they were regimented, something that Stephen utterly disliked. When may we expect to have something from you on the aesthetic question? The dean asked Stephen. From me? Said Stephen in astonishment. I stumble on an idea once a fortnight if I am lucky. So, to come upon a new idea, I can do that only once a fortnight. But that is also a kind of tall claim. It also suggests that Stephen is some kind of a talented person. because most people do not come upon a new idea even in a month. So this reminds me of Joyce telling his friend when his friend asked him how much he wrote during the entire day. Then Joyce told him that he had already decided upon 2 words that he would be using in his writing. These questions are very profound, Mr. Dedalus said the Dean. It is like looking down from the cliffs of Mohar into the depths. Many go down into the depths and never come up. Only the trained diver can go down into those depths and explore them and come to the surface again. The Dean says that it is very difficult to speculate over these subjects. Stephen says, for my purpose I can work on at present by the light of 1 or 2 ideas of Aristotle and Aquinas. I quite see your point. Actually the Dean sees nothing. He does not understand what Stephen is, talking about. I need them only for my own use and guidance until I have done something for myself by their light. If the lamp smokes or smells, I shall try to trim it. If it does not give light enough, I shall sell it and buy another. So by this Stephen means that I use the ideas of Aristotle and Aquinas and I try to create something of my own in the light of those ideas. But if the lamp smells, means if they are not helpful, if I do not find them helpful, then I would not borrow anything from them. I would buy a new lamp, means I would read a new author, a different author. But the Dean has no clue that Stephen is talking metaphorically about the lamp. He takes it literally, suggesting his low intelligence compared to that of Stephen. So he says, Epictetus also had a lamp which was sold for a fancy price after his death, trying to appear very scholarly. He just mentions Epictetus, and Stephen says, an old gentleman who said that the soul is very like a bucket full of water. Now after this conversation, Stephen feels that it is an ugly conversation, because the images which are coming up, lamp and bucket, they are very sordid images. A smell of molten tallow came up from the Dean's candle butts and fused itself in Stephen's consciousness with the jingle of the words bucket and lamp, lamp and bucket. So you see synesthesia in operation here. The smell, the olfactory experience, blending with the auditory experience, the sounds of the words lamp and bucket. The priest's voice too had a hard jingling tone. Stephen's mind, halted by instinct, checked by the strange tone and the imagery, and by the priest's face, which seemed like an unlit lamp or a reflector hung in a false focus. Which means that there was no intelligence in the Dean's face. What lay behind it or within it? A dull torpor of the soul, or the dullness of the thundercloud, charged with intellection and capable of the gloom of God? So Stephen only says, I meant a different kind of lamps. And then we have a funny conversation here where Stephen uses a word, tandish, and the Dean uses the word funnel. And the Dean did not know that tandish is also an English word which means funnel. So the Dean is English himself, but here we see that Stephen's knowledge of English is better than him. To return to the lamp, he said, the feeding of it is also a nice problem. You must choose the pure oil and you must be careful when you pour it in not to overflow it, not to pour in more than that funnel can hold. What funnel? Asked Stephen. The funnel through which you pour the oil into your lamp. That, said Stephen, is that called a funnel? Is it not a tandish? What is a tandish? That, the funnel. Is that called a tandish in Ireland? Asked the Dean. I never heard the word in my life. It is called a tandish in Lower Drumcondra, said Stephen, laughing, where they speak the best English. So the dean, being an Englishman, does not know English like Stephen, and that indicates that Stephen is already ready to take revenge upon the English for dominating the Irish for so many years by excelling in writing in their language. And then on the next page, after this discussion about Tundish and Funnell, we see Stephen is reflecting on the question of language. Here it is English. The language in which we are speaking is his before it is mine. That is, the dean is English, therefore this language is properly his than Stephen's. How different are the words home, Christ, ale, master on his lips and on mine. You notice that these words are typically English words. I cannot speak or write these words without unrest of spirit. His language, so familiar and so foreign, will always be for me an acquired speech. I have not made or accepted its words. My voice holds them at bay. My soul frets in the shadow of his language. So Stephen thinks that he can never actually master the language. Even if he is skillful in that language will never belong to him, and therefore there will always be some distance between him and the English language. And we have seen that Joyce exactly took this revenge upon English by not only mastering the language, but making all kinds of experimentation with the language. The novel Finnegan's Wake, in that novel Joyce describes a man who is sleeping and dreaming, and therefore in that novel the language completely changes. Every word is metamorphosed into something different, like during sleep a person's consciousness changes. So Joyce experimented with the English language like no other author. And skipping the descriptions of the university classes, there is the description of MacCann, who speaks with fluent energy of the Tsar's rescript, of state, of general disarmament, arbitration in cases of international disputes, of the signs of the times, of the new humanity and the new gospel of life, which would make it the business of the community to secure as cheaply as possible the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number. So it was a political campaign by the Tsar of Russia about universal peace, in which MacCann was participating, and he was collecting signatures from all the students. And as he asked Stephen to sign, then he says, I am waiting for your answer. And Stephen replies, the affair doesn't interest me in the least, said Stephen wearily. You know that well. Why do you make a scene about it? Good, said MacCann, smacking his lips. You are a reactionary then. So here we see a typical representation of student politics, and some students are interested in politics, others are not interested, some are interested in creative arts, and so on. So Stephen is not interested in politics. So MacCann calls him a reactionary. Do you think you impress me when you flourish your wooden sword? Stephen says. Metaphors, said MacCann bluntly. Come to facts. Stephen blushed and turned aside. MacCann stood his ground and said with hostile humor, minor poets, I suppose, are above such trivial questions as the question of universal peace. Cranley from time to time speaks in Latin, thus showing how university students would sometimes use Latin. But what is funny is that he even swears in Latin, like he says pax super totum sanguinarium globum, the universal peace over this bloody world. Sanguinarium means bloody, so he uses these words also in Latin. So Stephen moves away from the bystanders, jerked his shoulders angrily in the direction of the Tsar's image. So apparently the Tsar's picture was also there, and he says, keep your icon. If we must have a Jesus, let us have a legitimate Jesus. So I do not want an icon who is not a legitimate savior of the world. Cranley jokes with his Latin speech, nos ad manum ballum jocabimus. We are going to play handball. Stephen, in the act of being led away, caught sight of McCann's flushed, blunt-featured face. And then he says, my signature is of no account, he said politely. You are right to go your way, leave me to go mine. So Stephen is disliked by others for his independence of spirit. He is being called an intellectual crank and minor poet and so on and so forth. So people do not like him because he does not join any cause. So this part of the dialogue with McCann and others, this is important to show how Stephen also rejects politics. So first he rejected religion, then he rejects politics, he rejects family ties. So he rejects a number of things in order to make art his only goal or only way. Then there is the dialogue with Lynch over art. So it is still not clear. Okay. The dialogue with Devin continues. It is a very long dialogue because it is about Irish nationalism, and through this dialogue Stephen makes it clear, or we may say Joyce makes it clear, how Stephen rejects Irish nationalism and why. Stephen says when he is being pushed by Devin that being an Irish, why doesn't he support the Irish nationalism? Stephen says, this race and this country and this life produced me, he said. I shall express myself as I am. So I am also the product of this country, of this race, but I am different and I will express myself as I am. Try to be one of us, repeated Devin. In your heart you are an Irishman, but your pride is too powerful. My ancestors threw off their language and took another, Stephen said. They allowed a handful of foreigners to subject them. Do you fancy I am going to pay in my own life and person debts they made? What for? So my ancestors threw away their own language, their own culture, and accepted English language and culture. Now why should I pay their debts and fight for us? For our freedom, said Devin. No honorable and sincere man has given up to you his life and his youth and his affections, from the days of Tone to those of Parnell, but you sold him to the enemy or failed him in need or reviled him and left him for another, and you invite me to be one of you. I would see you damned first. So the reference to Parnell is there throughout this novel from the very beginning, and there was this quarrel during the Christmas dinner when Stephen was a very small child. So Parnell was betrayed by the Irish priests, the Roman Catholic priests, and he was assassinated by them. Therefore Stephen says that no Irish nationalist hero is there who has not been betrayed by you or slandered against by you, or in some way or other. The Irish people have not been kind to their heroes. Then why do you expect me to be like them? They died for their ideals, Stevie, said Devin. Our day will come yet, believe me. And then Stephen does not believe in this kind of hollow nationalism or political ideas. He says, the soul is born, he said vaguely, first in those moments I told you of. It has a slow and dark birth, more mysterious than the birth of the body. When the soul of a man is born in this country, there are nets flung at it to hold it back from flight. You talk to me of nationality, language, religion. I shall try to fly by those nets. So in this speech, we see clearly Stephen's rejection of nationality, language, religion, all these issues, and he looks upon them as nets to catch a soul. So he does not want to be trapped. He wants to freely express himself, go his own way. Davin does not understand his speech, too deep for me, he says. Do you know what Ireland is? Asked Stephen with cold violence. Ireland is the old soul that eats her Pharaoh. So this destructive image of an old soul eating her own Pharaoh, that is her own litter. So Ireland in Stephen's eyes is like that, which destroys its own children. Then the dialogue with Lynch begins, and Stephen begins by defining pity and terror. He says that Aristotle has not defined pity and terror, I have. Pity is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings and unites it with the human sufferer. Terror is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human suffering and unites it with the secret cause. So Lynch obviously does not immediately understand. So in these definitions, Stephen suggests that the tragic emotions, pity and terror, evoked by a tragedy, they arrest a man's thought or emotions. So they are of a static emotion. They create static emotions. They do not lead one to further a desire. The tragic emotion, in fact, is a face looking two ways, towards terror and towards pity, both of which are phases of it. You see, I use the word arrest. I mean that the tragic emotion is static, or rather the dramatic emotion is. The feelings excited by improper art are kinetic, desire or loathing. So improper art, for example, pornography, would lead one to some desire. This desire could be either of loving it or wanting it, or could be loathing. So it would always give rise to some desire or loathing, which means it would prompt towards further action, further motivation, and that is why it is called kinetic, because it leads to motion. The feelings excited by improper art are kinetic, desire or loathing. Desire urges us to possess, to go to something. Loathing urges us to abandon, to go from something. These are kinetic emotions. The arts which excite them, pornographical or didactic, are therefore improper arts. Now notice that he brackets pornography with didacticism, because didacticism also tells one to do something moral, to do something good. And pornography also tells one to do something. So both are, according to Stephen, improper arts because they are kinetic in nature. The aesthetic emotion, I use the general term, is therefore static. The mind is arrested and raised above desire and loathing. Then as Stephen looks at Lynch, there also he kind of finds a serpent-like, reptile-like feature. So he looks at his friends very critically. The long, slender, flattened skull beneath the long, pointed cap brought before Stephen's mind the image of a hooded reptile. The eyes too were reptile-like in glint and gaze, yet at that instant humbled and alert in their look, They were lit by one tiny human point, the window of a shriveled soul, poignant and self-embittered. So basically, he finds in the Irish boys that their soul is shriveled, dominated by so many ideologies that their souls cannot expand. Then he explains his aesthetic theory. Art, said Stephen, is the human disposition of sensible or intelligible matter for an aesthetic end. Then he again refers to Aquinas. Aquinas, said Stephen, says that is beautiful, the apprehension of which pleases. Lynch nodded. I remembered that. Pulchra sunt quae visa placent. He uses the word visa, said Stephen, to cover aesthetic apprehension of all kinds, whether through sight or hearing or through any other avenue of apprehension. This word, though it is vague, is clear enough to keep away good and evil, which excite desire and loathing. So good and evil should be out of aesthetic discussion, according to Stephen, because these considerations, moralistic considerations, lead to desire and loathing. It is some kind of kinetic movement. So we can see that Stephen's aesthetic theory is like art for art's sake. It is an aestheticist theory. The emphasis on art is for no other purpose apart from art. So art falls back upon itself. But why? To that Stephen has no answer. So Stephen explains that true art is static. Static, therefore, said Stephen. Plato, I believe, said that beauty is the splendor of truth. I don't think that it has a meaning, but the true and beautiful are akin. Truth is beheld by the intellect, which is appeased by the most satisfying relations of the intelligible. Beauty is beheld by the imagination, which is appeased by the most satisfying relations of the sensible. The first step in the direction of truth is to understand the frame and scope of the intellect itself, to comprehend the act itself of intellection. Aristotle's entire system of philosophy rests upon his book of Psychology, and that, I think, rests on his statement that the same attribute cannot at the same time and in the same connection belong to and not belong to the same subject. So, according to Stephen, truth and beauty, they belong to different domains. Even though Plato confuses the two, Plato in his discussion of beauty brings in the idea of truth and thus confuses the two. Stephen, with the help of Aristotle, Aristotle's rule that one art or one discipline should have only one subject, Stephen says that these two should not be confused. So, Keats's famous expression, beauty, truth, truth, beauty, even though that might be a romantic expression, that would not be acceptable from Stephen's point of view. So, Lynch asks, what is beauty? And Stephen tries to explain beauty with his theory based on Aquinas. And in this theory, he gives us three terms: integritas, consonantia, and claritas. We will see how Stephen uses these concepts. Even though he borrows from Aquinas, his concepts are not exactly the same as that of Aquinas. So I skip a few pages. To finish what I was saying about beauty, said Stephen, the most satisfying relations of the sensible must therefore correspond to the necessary phases of artistic apprehension. Find these and you find the qualities of universal beauty. So relations of the sensible according to Stephen, Stephen's theory is therefore to some extent Aristotelian insofar as it is dependent upon the relations of the sensible, and of course it is bound to be Aristotelian because he is following Aquinas, who followed Aristotle. Aquinas says, alt pulcritudinem tria requirentur integritas consonantia claritas. Three things are needed for beauty: wholeness, harmony, and radiance. Do these correspond to the phases of apprehension? And then he explains this thing by giving the example of a basket. So he says the idea of integritas, it is the idea of wholeness. So you draw a contour, you draw a contour, you draw a line describing the basket, and that gives us its integrity or its wholeness, its shape. So this line makes it different from the background. The basket stands out. The first phase of apprehension is a bounding line drawn about the object to be apprehended. An aesthetic image is presented to us either in space or in time. Or in time, because not all art is on space. Some arts depend on time, for example music. What is audible is presented in time, what is visible is presented in space, but temporal or spatial, the aesthetic image is first luminously apprehended as self-bounded and self-contained upon the immeasurable background of space or time, which is not it. So space or time is only the background. You apprehend it as one thing, you see it as one whole, you apprehend its wholeness, this is integritas. Bull's eye, said Lynch, laughing. Go on. Then said Stephen, you pass from point to point, led by its formal lines. You apprehend it as balanced part against part within its limits. So consonantia is translated by Stephen as harmony, the harmonious relationship between the parts and the rhythm that it creates. Stephen calls it the rhythm of its structure. In other words, the synthesis of immediate perception is followed by the analysis of apprehension. Having first felt that it is one thing, you feel now that it is a thing. You apprehend it as a complex, multiple, divisible, separable, made up of its parts, the result of its parts, and their sum, harmonious, that is consonantia. So, Stephen is drawing from scholastic discussion of art. Aquinas was a scholastic philosopher, and we see the influence of the Middle Ages. There is a book called The Middle Ages of James Joyce, where we see where the author discusses the influence of Middle Ages on Joyce's writing. So consonantia is the harmonious rhythm created by the relations between the parts. The connotation of the word, Stephen said, is rather vague, that is claritas. Aquinas uses a term which seems to be inexact. It baffled me for a long time. It would lead you to believe that he had in mind symbolism or idealism, the supreme quality of beauty being a light from some other world. Claritas literally means illumination or light. But how do we see claritas in a work of art? What kind of illumination? It must be used here metaphorically. The supreme quality of beauty being a light from some other world, the idea of which the matter is but the shadow, the reality of which it is but the symbol. Now this idea is Platonic, as you all know, that the truth is an idea and the matter is its shadow. I thought he might mean that claritas is the artistic discovery and representation of the divine purpose in anything or a force of generalization which would make the aesthetic image a universal one, make it outshine its proper conditions, but that is literary talk. So this was going to be a religious explanation, but Stephen rejects it. When you have apprehended that basket as one thing and have then analyzed it according to its form and apprehended it as a thing, you make the only synthesis which is logically and aesthetically permissible. You see that it is that thing which it is and no other thing. The radiance of which he speaks is the scholastic quidditas, the whatness of a thing. So there is this term in scholastic logic, quidditas, which means the whatness. Quid means what? Quidditas, whatness. So whatness of a thing or the thingness of a thing, that is the claritas according to Stephen. This supreme quality is felt by the artist when the aesthetic image is first conceived in his imagination. The mind in that mysterious instant, Shelley likened beautifully to a fading coal. The instant wherein that supreme quality of beauty, the clear radiance of the aesthetic image, is apprehended luminously by the mind, which has been arrested by its coldness and fascinated by its harmony, is the luminous silent stasis of aesthetic pleasure, a spiritual state very like to that cardiac condition which the Italian physiologist Luigi Galvani, using a phrase almost as beautiful as Shelley's, called the enchantment of the heart. So Stephen here mixes a bit of science. Galvani experimented on electricity, and by providing electric shock to a frog, he established that it temporarily suspends the movement of the heart, which he called enchantment of the heart. So Stephen says that the moment when the mind receives this illumination in any artistic work, in the mind of the artist, that moment of illumination is claritas. Right. So we'll stop here today, and we will finish our discussion of the aesthetic theory in the next class, and then we'll discuss the questions. So let me know if you have any questions.